Hey guys, welcome to this week's small group. And if you were here this last Sunday, we talked about God's sovereignty, and perhaps for some of us that's a new concept. And God's sovereignty means that God is in control. Whatever God sets out to accomplish, He's going to accomplish, and nothing is going to stop Him. And what's interesting is that God doesn't mess with our free will, but He's still going to accomplish His purposes. And we saw that in the story of King Solomon and his son Rehoboam. Remember, King Solomon disobeyed God, and so God said, listen, I'm going to rip the kingdom out of your hands, but because of the promises that I made to your father, King David, I'm not going to rip it out of your hands, I'm going to rip it out of the hands of your son. And so here comes Rehoboam. And so we're all expecting God to just kind of come in by force, but He doesn't. He allows Rehoboam to use his own free will decision, and God still accomplishes His purposes. So this is a great example of how God's sovereignty can be bad because it didn't work out for Rehoboam, but how is the concept of God's sovereignty supposed to comfort us as believers in Jesus Christ? In today's Bible study, we're going to be investigating the circumstances surrounding the story of Rehoboam, the one that we covered on Sunday. So we're going to be looking at his father and some of the decisions that he made. We're also going to be looking at the next king of the northern kingdoms and some of the decisions that he made. So what I want you to do now is read 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. And what I want you to do as a small group is discuss the deal that God made with King Solomon. What was the deal? And then once you figure out what the deal was that God was making with King Solomon, I want you to ask the question, was the deal that God made with Solomon a fair deal? Why or why not? One of the things I want you to notice is that the deal was to honor God and not to worship other gods. Don't get confused that it says to walk uprightly and to have integrity. It's talking about having integrity of the heart. He didn't have to do everything perfect. He could make mistakes as long as he just continued to make God first. You notice how God was saying, hey, be like your father, King David. Well, King David wasn't perfect. King David messed up royally. He slept with another man's wife. He had that man put to death so that he could cover up his sin and so that she could have his son. It was a mess. But at the end of the day, King David kept God first. And that was the challenge to Solomon. See, God was not asking for perfection. So I'm sure Solomon was thinking that, hey, this is easy. Just don't sacrifice to other gods. And I'm sure that he was just going, this will never happen to me. But what I want you to do is read 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. And ask the question, why did the deal with God become too difficult for King Solomon to obey? One of the things that you'll notice in this passage is that marrying foreign women put Solomon between a rock and a hard place. You see, King Solomon was trying to honor God, but at the same time be a good husband to these wives. And he didn't want to dishonor them by saying, well, you can't worship the gods that you grew up worshiping. And so it put him between a rock and a hard place. But my question is why did Solomon marry so many foreign women? I want you to talk about that in your small group. And also, how was God's rule against intermarrying inconvenient for King Solomon and the business of the kingdom? Give you a little hint there. See if you can come up with the answer. Perhaps somebody in your small group knew a little bit about the kingdoms and marrying practices in those days. But marriage was always part of a bigger business deal. Usually, marriage between just regular people was it was prearranged, and it was a business deal between the fathers of the two families. Well, in the same way, when a king would try to sign a treaty with another king, or he would make a deal with another king, they would end up marrying the daughter of the other king to say, "Hey, we're family now." And God's rule against intermarrying was inconvenient for the politics that King Solomon was a part of. So what are some of the inconvenient rules that God has given to us? And how might breaking some of these inconvenient rules lead to unforeseen consequences? Next, I want you to read 1 Kings 11, 26 through 38. Just skip down a little bit further on the chapter there. Now we're talking about Jeroboam. Jeroboam is the one who's going to actually take the kingdom. So why is God giving most of the kingdom to Jeroboam? And what is Jeroboam responsible for as his part of his deal with God? I want you to notice that Jeroboam is getting the kingdom because Solomon was unfaithful to God. It wasn't because Jeroboam was going to be this great leader or whatever. The reason he was getting it was by default because the guy before him had messed everything up. And so the only reason he was getting this is because King Solomon was unfaithful to God. And God made the same deal with Jeroboam that he made with King Solomon. It was the same deal. If you're faithful to me, I will make your kingdom endure. And Solomon's failure served as an example to Jeroboam of what would happen if he didn't follow up with his part of the deal. So you would think that Jeroboam would have learned from King Solomon's example. But after King Solomon dies and Rehoboam makes the decision that ultimately divides the kingdom, Jeroboam becomes the king of the northern kingdom. And what I want you to do is read 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 26 through 31. Two questions. Why did Jeroboam disobey the deal that he had with God? And how might understanding the concept of the sovereignty of God have prevented Jeroboam's unfaithfulness? What I'm hoping that you're noticing is that Jeroboam disobeyed God out of fear. Who was he fearing? He was fearing the people. You notice in the passage, he was so afraid that if the people from the northern kingdom, who he was in charge of, went to go offer sacrifices in the southern kingdom, which was located in Jerusalem, he was afraid that they would leave him and they would serve the other king. And so he was afraid of the people. But remember what we talked about a couple weeks ago, fearing God is the beginning of wisdom. The problem is that when we take our eyes off of God and we stop fearing Him, we start fearing our circumstances on earth. And see, if he would have understood God's sovereignty, you see, God's sovereignty means God is in control. And he had the same problem. He had fear that he wasn't going to be able to accomplish the things that God already said, I'm going to allow you to accomplish, as King Solomon did. King Solomon was thinking, man, if I don't marry these women, I'm not going to be able to close these deals. But at the end of the day, God is sovereign, and if God wants you to close those deals, guess what? It's going to happen, and nothing's going to stop him from accomplishing that. So how are we sometimes disobedient to God out of fear of our circumstances? And how might the concept of God's sovereignty and fearing God help us in this life? Finish up with these last two questions and have a great rest of a Bible study.